Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Air Force Association at the conclusion of a Mitchell Institute breakfast series on nuclear deterrence and missile defense. That's been a congressional breakfast series that's been going on since 1983. And the guest speaker today was General Chilton, who was former commander of U.S. Strategic Command, but also an illustrious astronaut for all of us who were paying attention, and also the first astronaut to make 4 stars. So you defied the odds of some astronauts whose career derails their military career. Sir, it was a fascinating discussion, reminiscent in some ways to the talk you gave at the Heritage Foundation when last we spoke in late January. That was before the Nuclear Posture Review was issued. Talk to us a little bit about your assessment of the Nuclear Posture Review. What did it get right, and where did it fall a little bit short that you think will require some more work?
Well, I thought it was a very good document. It tells the story of what the threat is to the United States, what's changed in the world environment, which is really important to put the threat in context, and then what steps we need to take to ensure that our deterrent continues to be effective for years ahead. And there's a lot of work to be done there, and I think it highlights the work that needs to be done. So I think it's a very good document. I think there's a lot of discussion about some of the pieces in it with regard to is it specific or not, or too specific. At the end of the day, we have to remember it's a policy document that's a review and an umbrella for subsequent direction. So from that will come implementation, policy and guidance and direction to the services and also to the national labs. And they'll also be bottom up. They'll read it too and say, okay, this is the direction that the administration wants to go, and as we always do in the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy, we saddle up and look at ways to make it successful.
You mentioned in your talk that you were concerned that there wasn't enough of an integrated strategy to deal, for example, with the Russian intellectual model of escalate to de-escalate, use a nuclear weapon early in a conflict to sort of force everybody to stand down. John Hyten takes exception with that. He says it's an improper translation of what the Russians are really doing, and there are ways to deter that. But from your standpoint, what is the integrated national strategy we need, and what piece of that is particularly important, aiming it, for example, at that kind of a Russian approach, which is trying to inculcate and get their own military very comfortable with the nuclear word, disturbingly so?
Yeah, well, I think what is in the NPR is necessary. I don't think it's sufficient, but nor do I think the document was the appropriate place to lay out a strategy to what you ultimately want to do is to get the Russians to change their declaratory policy and intent in that regard. You have to believe what they say when they say they have a policy of escalate to de-escalate. And so my comment on that was really not that the posture review wasn't correct, but that more work needs to be done, and knowing the Department of Defense and how they're led today and the strategist in charge of it, I'm sure there is. But whenever you want to change something like this or shape another country's perspective, particularly if it's not in our interest, you want to use all elements of national power, diplomacy, economics, military, et cetera. And just a weapons change or a new weapon isn't necessarily the only, part. It could be part of the solution. Like I said, I think it's necessary but not sufficient.
You told a story about when you were a short-sighted programmer, which you did twice, that to save $400 million, you thought it was a great idea to close the nuclear storage facilities in Europe. And a lot of people may or may not know that there are American nuclear weapons that are NATO assets that are over in Europe, in a number of countries. Why? And you said that it was a little bit of a fluke, that we hadn't informed our allies that we might withdraw them, so that bought one more year, and then the global strategic circumstance changed, and it was fortunate you had it. Why is it important to have things like B-61s, but also a new generation of cruise missile, for example, forward deployed in countries? Why is that such an important capability, not just for the United States, but for its allies?
Well, first of all, my mistake was I didn't really understand U.S. policy, and I was just a programmer trying to find money. So fortunately, I was educated since then. And we never really came close to closing them, other than it probably would have been turned around, my position, when it got to more mature decision makers, more informed, which at the last minute in our debates internally, we got that message. So what I didn't appreciate was the importance of NATO's and our allies in Europe of having this capability. as a part of the deterrent force. When you deter someone, you don't want to just you don't want to be a one-trick pony. You want it to be a difficult calculus for them to sort through to make a bad decision, which hopefully they never will. That's the point of deterrence, is we don't want them to make a bad decision to either invade our friends and allies, U.S. forces, or in the case of Putin's policy, deploy nuclear weapons as first use. So I really do believe that it's important for our NATO allies to be a part of the deterrent calculus that the Russians have to consider. It is a deterrent. You know, we're not talking about ever expanding the West into Russia. It is to prevent miscalculation and their stated intentions of expanding and proven intentions, given what they've done in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, in Ossetia and Abkhazia, that they are still an expansionistic country.
And it's also assurance, isn't it? Because the Japanese, for example, were very disappointed when we withdrew our nuclear-tipped Tomahawk cruise missiles from Japan.
Well, they were never in Japan, but
never in Japan.
They were deployable in theater, and so also in your first question there, you talked about putting cruise missiles in Europe. That's not what the NPR suggests. It suggests a submarine-launched cruise missile, which you know, it can be in international waters and conduct its operations, and so we don't necessarily have to be on someone else's sovereign soil to present this deterrent problem to an adversary who's threatened to escalate. And again, it's all about, we don't want them to miscalculate and think that we don't have the will to defend our allies in NATO or in the Western Pacific. We don't want any adversary to doubt our umbrella, and nor do we want our allies to doubt our umbrella. And to make your umbrella credible, both to the adversary and to those friends and partners and allies that we assure, you've got to have the right tools. I mean, they have to be believable weapon systems. And here's the paradox. You know, you get criticized for, you know, if you build that weapon, you're more likely to use it. Well, I argue we use them every day to deter, and that's why we want the flexible capability. And we want them to look at that flexible capability, various yields, various ways to deploy and employ, and think twice about ever crossing the threshold.
Well, and that's the point you made, right? That it actually makes sense for an F-35 to have a B-61 on it, because that injects an entirely different calculus in the mind of an adversary.
It does, and you know, you want to provide all future presidents of the United States options, and no politician, no leader ever wants just one solution offered by his Department of Defense or her Department of Defense for a circumstance. And so hence the necessity and desire for flexibility, because you don't know what's going to be in front of you. And with the way our infrastructure is today, we can't quickly adapt our inventories like we used to be able to do in the Cold War, just because we've let that decay, which is an entirely different issue, which demands investment.
We talked to General Hyten yesterday, and one of the things that he explained was, you know, some of Secretary Mattis's points up on the Hill about what the value, the deterrent value, and the incremental cost from a national budget and a national investment standpoint. Let me take you, because I know you've got to run, two quick questions. One is, did the nuclear posture review get the low-yield device part of the equation right in terms of the sort of lower-yield weapons that it propose, or do you think that there should be a different plan?
Well, you're not going to get me second-guessing the SecDef and the President and certainly John Hyten. They are the ones that are in the positions and have far more information than me to make that decision. What I would suggest, though, is that, again, back to our infrastructure problems I mentioned in the Department of Energy, which is responsible for being able to provide nuclear weapons. And if you want flexibility, given the problems with infrastructure, we're not going to, and given the policy constraints that have been imposed upon the department by previous administrations, going all the way back to the Reagan administration, or I'm sorry, the Clinton administration, but through all previous administrations, of not being able to build new capability, which is a unilateral imposition on us that no one else in the world follows. You got to use the modification approach,
right?
And if you need it quickly, you don't have time to design and build it today. It's important that we exercise that design, build human capital, and so when you start talking about a new cruise missile deployable for a submarine, there's a great opportunity here to educate a new generation of weapons designers, weapons engineers, machinists, et cetera, that haven't had the opportunity to do any of that since 1988. And that's an important thing. At the same time, if there's a quicker way for modification to provide the capability that the President says the nation needs, then that's what you do as well.
Last question. There is a big debate in Washington about whether the United States walking away from the Iran nuclear deal would actually make it much more difficult to negotiate a deal with the North Koreans, who have suggested that are willing to put weapons on the table. Granted, the North Koreans don't have a very good track record of abiding by these agreements, but everybody has to take kind of an open mind as they go into it, because this time it could be different. From your standpoint, is there a linkage between that? The logic of that being that if you're a Kim, you've seen several despots around the world who've let go of that capability, or have been forced to let go of that capability, end up either being hung or shot by their own people.
Well, I don't see the linkage, frankly. First of all, the North Koreans are liars. His grandfather was a liar, his father was a liar, and he's a liar. It's really hard to negotiate with a liar or to sign a treaty with a liar. And usually the only way you can dig yourself out of that reputation is to demonstrate a commitment, actually execute to your commitments. So I never say never when it comes to North Korea, and I'm glad we always continue to look at diplomatic solutions. But we have to walk into this with the, wide-eyed and understanding of the history of this dictatorship. And I don't see the linkages with Iran, nor do I see the linkages even with what happened to Saddam and Muammar Gaddafi. There was 3 countries that have been forced to give up their nuclear programs: Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Syria was because Israel destroyed the nuclear power plant that the North Koreans had given to Syria to build nuclear weapons. Assad is still alive. So if you look at what happened to Saddam, it was Iraqis who caught him and killed him. If you look at what happened to Muammar, it was Libyans who caught him and killed him. There's no indication that any South Korean or American is interested in going into North Korea and doing away with Kim Jong-un.
Nor many in North Korea who appear ready to do it either.
No, yeah, so I just see it as kind of a non sequitur in the argument. The argument has always been made, he sees what's happened to other people. Now, you get in a shooting war, that's a different story, but we're not there. And so, nor have we ever indicated that we were in a mind to invade that country.
Right. And
since
so
since 1953, since the last time they invaded the South.
And you would say then that nuclear deterrence even works with a rogue regime like North Korea when it looks at relative capabilities. He may have a handful of bombs, but we actually have a demonstrated capability.
Well, I think what I say is that we have to look at that relationship, that deterrence calculus, differently. When there's uneven stakes on the table, which there are, we certainly hold an existential threat over him, and he does not over us. He holds a significant threat over our allies. But it's different. They're different table stakes. He goes in with a small stack of chips. We don't have to put all our chips in to match or exceed his. And so what I commend is that we think we don't just broad brush how you deter different countries, say it's the same calculus every time. No, every decision maker is different. Every decision maker has a different calculus. And when the U.S. and Stratcom does this, they know this fully, that we look at how we deter Russia differently than how we deter China and how we deter North Korea, et cetera. And that's the thing that's different from the Cold War, where we had essentially parity, is now we have players that are inferior but have a deadly capability, and we have to make sure we're thinking through clearly how we deter them from using it.
Because as a dead ender, he may decide to deploy them at a different phase than we might expect them to deploy.
Under different circumstances, perhaps, yeah.
Retired United States Air Force General Kevin Chilton, former commander of U.S. Strategic Command, as well as an astronaut, sir. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.